In 1901, archaeologists digging in what is now Iran uncovered a 7-foot slab of black basalt, covered top to bottom in tightly carved cuneiform script, standing upright and remarkably well preserved despite nearly 4 millennia buried in the earth. It had been looted from Babylon roughly 3,000 years earlier and dragged hundreds of miles away as a war trophy by a conquering king who apparently valued the stone itself more than whatever laws were written on it. When researchers finally translated it, they realized they were looking at something remarkable, a nearly complete legal code written down and displayed in public almost 4,000 years ago. And buried inside it, alongside the laws you'd expect about theft and violence, is something almost nobody mentions when this stone gets talked about. A surprisingly sophisticated set of rules for handling debt, interest rates, bad business deals, and exactly what happens when a natural disaster wipes out your ability to pay someone back. Some of these laws describe financial concepts that wouldn't reappear in written law for well over 3,000 years. Picture yourself as a farmer outside Babylon in the year 1750 BC. You borrowed grain from a merchant at the start of the season, agreeing to repay it with interest after the harvest. It was a completely ordinary arrangement. Everyone in your position did the same thing, and the merchant had no reason to expect anything other than a normal repayment when the season ended. Then a storm rolled in early, flattening your field before you could bring anything in. Your entire harvest gone in an afternoon, along with the grain you'd need to both feed your family and repay what you owed. Under most ancient legal traditions, this would be entirely your problem. You made a promise, the promise wasn't fulfilled, and the consequences would fall on you regardless of the reason behind the failure. Debt bondage was common across the ancient world. People who couldn't pay what they owed could be forced into servitude, sometimes along with their entire family for years at a time, working in a creditor's household until the debt was considered settled. You have every reason to expect the worst outcome here. A debt you cannot possibly pay, a merchant who has every legal right to come collect what you now owe him, one way or another, and a family that might end up working off that debt in his household instead of your own, with no clear end date in sight. So you walk into the city, toward the public square, where a massive black stone stands for anyone to read, or more accurately, for anyone to have read aloud to them, since most ordinary people couldn't read the cuneiform script themselves, and relied on scribes stationed nearby for exactly this purpose. And carved into that stone is a specific clause that applies exactly to your situation. If a person's crop is destroyed by a storm, that year's interest is canceled entirely. Not reduced, canceled. The debt itself doesn't vanish, but the punishing weight of interest piling on top of a disaster you had no control over does. For a farmer standing in front of that stone with nothing left in his fields, this single clause is the difference between a difficult year and the loss of everything he has. So how did a legal system this specific actually work? And why does it matter that it was written down at all, rather than simply left to the judgment of whoever happened to be in charge? The Code of Hammurabi, compiled around 1754 BC under the Babylonian king of the same name, contains roughly 282 individual laws covering property, contracts, family matters, and criminal punishment. It's famous today mostly for one brutal-sounding principle: an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, the literal origin of that phrase. But the financial sections of the code reveal something far more interesting than pure punishment. They reveal a deliberate attempt to build a functioning, predictable economic system for an empire whose wealth depended entirely on trade running smoothly. Interest rates weren't left to negotiation or exploitation. The code set a hard ceiling: no more than 20% annual interest on a loan of silver, and no more than 33.33% on a loan of grain, which naturally carried more risk given how easily crops could fail before repayment came due, exposed as they were to storms, drought, and pests in a way that silver simply wasn't. A merchant who charged more than the legal rate faced a real, enforceable penalty. He forfeited the entire loan amount he was owed, principal included, walking away with nothing rather than the extra profit he'd been chasing. Overcharging wasn't just frowned upon socially. It was structured so that breaking the rule cost the lender more than simply lending honestly ever would have, which is precisely the kind of incentive design modern regulators still try to build into financial law today. Merchants who use traveling agents to sell goods across long distances, sending caravans of grain, oil, or textiles far beyond Babylon's borders in search of better markets, were required to provide a formal itemized receipt for everything entrusted to that agent before he ever left the city. Without a receipt, No claim about missing goods held up in front of a judge. No matter how convincing the merchant's story sounded, if an agent came back and simply couldn't account for what he'd been given, he legally owed double the value back to the merchant who trusted him. An early, remarkably direct answer to the exact kind of dispute that still fills modern courtrooms whenever one business claims another failed to deliver on an agreement. Property fraud was treated with equal specificity. If a person bought a field, house, or plantation from someone who didn't actually have the legal right to sell it, the buyer's contract was voided entirely, and he lost the money he'd paid while the property itself reverted to its rightful owner. This placed real responsibility on buyers to verify who they were actually dealing with, rather than allowing an innocent-sounding excuse to protect someone who'd unknowingly purchased stolen or misrepresented property. A rule modern real estate law still wrestles with under different names. Even something as specific as a house collapsing was covered. If a builder constructed a home so poorly that it collapsed and killed the person living in it, the builder himself could be put to death, and if the collapse instead killed the homeowner's son, the code specified that the builder's own son would face the same fate, a form of proportional retribution that feels almost incomprehensibly harsh today, but was entirely consistent with the code's broader logic. The code treated financial and physical harm from negligence as something the law had to directly punish, not something the injured party simply had to absorb on their own. This is the transferable pattern worth remembering. Nearly 4,000 years ago, a functioning legal system had already figured out that written, publicly displayed, predictable rules make an economy work better than power and threats alone. A merchant couldn't simply charge whatever he wanted and enforce it through intimidation, because the law set a visible limit everyone could point to and cite by name. A farmer wasn't left entirely at the mercy of bad luck, because a specific clause existed for exactly his situation, one he could recite to a judge without needing a lawyer to translate the concept for him. The specific, practical insight is this: predictable rules known in advance to everyone involved reduce the leverage that powerful parties can exploit over vulnerable ones, whether that's a wealthy merchant over a struggling farmer or a modern lender over a modern borrower. And that principle didn't originate with modern contract law. It's one of the oldest ideas in written history, older than most of the civilizations we consider ancient today. 3 things worth remembering from this. First, the world's oldest surviving comprehensive legal code already contained interest rate caps, collateral rules, and disaster relief clauses, concepts many people assume are entirely modern financial inventions, developed by central banks and regulators sometime in the last century. They are, in fact, nearly 4,000 years old, and were already sophisticated enough to distinguish between different types of loans, different levels of risk, and different circumstances of default. Second, the code punished dishonest business practices more severely than simple bad luck, drawing a clear legal line between a merchant who cheated someone and a farmer who lost a crop to a storm, a distinction that still shapes how modern law treats fraud versus misfortune. A creditor could pursue a genuinely dishonest debtor aggressively, but the law refused to treat an act of nature the same way it treated an act of deception, a distinction that required real judgment to build into a legal system this early in human history. Third, the entire system depended on the law being visible and knowable in advance. The steel was deliberately placed in public, and its own inscription states that anyone wronged should have its words read aloud to them, ensuring that illiteracy couldn't be used as an excuse by the powerful to exploit those who couldn't read the script themselves. A legal system's power came not just from its punishments, but from the fact that everyone, rich or poor, literate or not, could know the rules before they needed them. If you want more of history's legal systems broken down like this, real mechanisms, real consequences, subscribe, because this channel is building a full series on the financial collapses and legal oddities history tends to skip over. And next time, we're jumping forward nearly 3,000 years to medieval Europe, where for centuries, disputes weren't settled with evidence or witnesses at all. They were settled with a sword in front of a crowd, with the outcome treated as a genuine legal verdict rather than a spectacle. Trial by combat was real, it was legal, and it stayed part of official European law far longer than most people realize, surviving in some jurisdictions well into an era we'd otherwise recognize as thoroughly modern.